Hi everyone! Today we're going to do another subdivision surface modeling exercise, and we're going to create this SciFi lid that you see here. I have prepared a file for you with reference images in the top and the front views, so if you want to follow along, please download the file. You will find a download link in the video description, and once you've opened the file we can get started. As usual, you can do an object like this in a number of ways, not only with respect to the techniques that you use, but also with respect to the type of topology that you want to create. And in this case, I want to create the topology so that I can add further details along these edges here if I want to. Bearing that in mind, we're going to do this in a certain way. I'm going to start with a flat object. Let's create a disk, and we won't be needing any segments, so I'm going to switch these to 1, and we also need to change the rotation segments. I'm going to start with 16, I think will do the job here. And you can see in this top view here, I've scaled the reference images so that it fits the dimensions of a standard Cinema 4D parametric disk. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to keep this as a helper object. And with this one, I'm going to decrease the outer radius and make it about 30. Looks good. And I also want an inner radius for this. So let's go ahead and do something like this maybe for now. Let's go ahead and make this editable by hitting C on the keyboard, and I'm going to select these two edges here using the rectangle selection tool. That's a little bit easier because the axis is getting in the way, and I'm going to hold down Control, left click and drag to quick extrude these edges out to about here. And you can see this extrusion here is a little bit longer, and it creates this shape here and goes beyond that circular shape of that disk object. But for now, we're going to keep it like this because later we will need to deform the object using shrink wrap and a sphere, and we're going to get less distortion if we add these extensions later. So for now, I'm going to keep it like this. We need a little more geometry in order to define this curve here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the loop knife to make a cut about here where that straight section starts. And then we can select these points here and move them over a little bit and then scale these out. And I should have made that disk a little bit smaller, I think. So let's go ahead and switch to model mode. I'm just going to hit T for scale, and I'm going to scale this down a little bit. Okay, something like this. And let's go back to edge mode, and I'll just move these edges forward a little bit further to about here. Okay, so that's looking good. And I also want an even distribution of the geometry here. That's going to be important because we're going to create a curved surface and we don't have enough geometry to create that shape yet. So with these edges selected, I'm going to use edge cut, and I'm going to add maybe 4 subdivisions. So we're getting nice squares here. And I think I'm going to select these edges here and scale them up just a little bit more. Okay, let's do something like this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all of this geometry here. So let's delete these points. And this is all that we need for now. And in order to make the next part a little bit easier, I'm going to hit Shift V to go to my viewport settings. And you can also do that by going to, where is that? I think Options, Configure. And you will get this viewport section here in the Attributes Manager. And if you go to the Back tab, we can rotate the reference image. And I'm going to rotate this 45 degrees, like so. Now we also need to rotate this object here. So we need 45 degrees or minus 45 degrees. And let's go ahead and change the rotation of the axis back to 0. And then we can use a symmetry object to mirror this over. We don't need to make this editable, but it's going to be a little bit easier to see what we're doing here. Now let's select the disk and switch to edge mode, and I'm going to extrude this edge over, and I'm going to scale it down and move it to 0 on the x-axis. And then I'm going to move it to about here. And then I'm going to use the helper disk that I have here. And let's go ahead and increase the rotation segments to something that more or less matches the edges here. And it's not going to be super precise or anything, but something like this should do. Maybe we can bring this back down to 36. So I think I want 4 segments here, and that's going to be fine. And now what we can do is, let's go to point mode and switch on snapping. And I'm going to select this point here and snap it to here. And let's add a few disk segments here. And I'm going to bring these up, and again, trying to match these up roughly with what we have on these parts here. So something like this should be fine. And let's go ahead and snap this point to here. And of course we need a couple more edges here. So let's go ahead and select these edges here. And let's use edge cuts, and we need 3 subdivisions here. And then we can use the move tool and position some of these points and snap them to the helper object. And I think we could also slide some of these points around a bit. So let's slide these back and just roughly line these up with the edges of our helper disk. Okay, so that looks good. Let's switch back to edge mode, and I'm going to extrude these edges twice. And let's go back to point mode and just move some of these points around again and snap them to the edges on the helper object. And these ones, we just want to move them straight up or down, like so. And let's go ahead and snap these points as well. Now you can see, if you take a look at the helper object, that these edges will finally collide with the edges of our object. That's not how I want to do the geometry, so we need to do this a little bit differently so that we get a nice and even mesh with a polygon loop around here. Let's go ahead and extrude these edges. And I think I'll just do one more extrusion here. And then again, let's go ahead and snap these points into place. So something like this. Let's switch off our helper object here. And let's close these gaps here. And for this we can maybe use the bridge tool in edge mode and just add these edges here. Now I don't want these to become this small here. And I want a more even distribution of these edges. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a script from the HB modeling bundle, which is called HB even distribution. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to select these edges here and then run that script. And now we're getting topology like this. Okay, so I think we do need to extrude these edges here one more time. And let's bring our helper object back here. And for now, I'm just going to snap these points to the edges of that helper object again. And then we need to make some adjustments here because we need to move these over like so maybe. Okay. And again, let's use bridge to bridge this gap here. And I'm going to run the even distribution script to even out the topology here. And then what I'm going to do is, again, using the bridge tool, I'm going to connect these edges here. And we don't have enough geometry here. So let's select these edges here and use connect points edges to create an edge here. And then use the bridge tool again to bridge this gap. And then we can use close polygon hole to close that hole here. And let me go to my viewport settings here. I'm just going to make this more transparent. Okay, so that's not looking too bad. Next, I'm going to even out the geometry a little more maybe. And for this, I'm going to use the slide tool. And we can move these points like this maybe. And maybe move this one over a little bit further. Okay, it doesn't need to be super precise or anything. Just something like that maybe. And I guess we could also move these points over a little bit like so. Okay, and I'm going to run that even distribution script on some of these edges again. Let's maybe try all of these here and see what we get. And that's looking good. And maybe I'll slide this point over a little bit to here and do something like this. So I think that looks pretty good. And let's see, now we can make this symmetry object editable. And I'm going to rotate this around again. First of all, let's change the rotation of the reference image back to 0. And let's rotate our object here 45 degrees. And let's reset the axis. And use two symmetry objects. And let's set this one to XY, and there we go. So we have created geometry that still follows that disk shape basically, but we have topology that will later allow us, if we wanted to add more details around these edges or actually anywhere on this surface. So I think we can be quite happy with the topology as it is. So let's go ahead and make these symmetry objects editable. And of course we still have this hole here at the center that we need to close. And I'm going to do that by using close polygon hole. And I think we need a little more geometry maybe here. So what I'll do is I'll select this n-gon here and let's scale it up a little bit. Maybe let's do something like this. And then use extrude inner to create another loop here. And then we need to remove this n-gon, of course. And we can do that by using connect points edges to connect some of these points, and then use the line cut tool to make a couple more cuts like this. And I'm going to select these points here at the center, and let's go ahead and use the brush, and the mode is smooth here. We don't need to change any of the other settings, and then we can just left click and drag until the points stop moving. Let's switch to the scale tool, and I'm going to scale these out a little bit further. And I think I'm going to scale all of these polygons a little bit further, something like this. Okay, and I think that should work fine. What we could do is, and I'll just eyeball this, I'm just going to slide some of these points here over a little bit further. Something like this. And I'll just use symmetry again to mirror the changes over. Okay. And let's see, we probably need to, I don't know, everything's fine, so, which was what I was just thinking, but everything's fine, so. Okay, so this is our topology for the lid, and I'm going to keep a backup copy of this. And the reason I'm doing this at this point is because if I want to add very small details, the geometry that we have right now is not enough. So what I would need to do if I wanted to add very small details is I would have to subdivide this mesh to be able to do that. And it's probably a good idea to do this while the object is still flat. And that's why I'm keeping a backup copy of this. And what we could do with this is use subdivide to create more topology that would enable us to add those smaller details should we wish to do so. Okay, so that's why I'm keeping this a backup copy, and what we're going to do with our object here is move it up. It doesn't really matter where you move it because it's going to be projected onto a sphere in a second. So now we're going to turn this into this actual three-dimensional shape here. And for this we need a sphere, and I'm going to move this down a little bit and scale it up. And I want it to follow this line here. So maybe let's move this down a little bit further and scale it up a little bit more, and maybe a little bit more. So it's not a perfect fit, but that's fine. Something like this should do. And then what we can do, if I rename this to lid, and this one maybe to lid flat final. Okay, and what I'm going to do with this lid is I'm going to add a shrink wrap deformer as a child. And the shrink wrap deformer needs the sphere as the target object. Now, if I hit NH on the keyboard, you can see the geometry of the sphere as well. And a shrink wrap will only work well if you have enough geometry on this sphere here. And we could switch that off. If I reduce the segments, you can see the shape is getting less and less accurate. So we want to bring these segments up, and at some point you will see that nothing really changes anymore, and that means we have enough segments. So something like this should do perfectly fine. Now you can also see that the deformation causes the edges also deforms the edges on our object. We'll need to fix that. But the deformation actually is relatively small, and the reason for that is because we created a pretty nice and even mesh. And I think we could even select these edges here and scale those up a little bit further, and select these polygons and also scale them up a little bit further, something like this. Okay, so that will even out the geometry even a little bit more. And I think that looks good. So this is what we have right now. Let's go ahead and select the lid and right click and use current state to object. And if I drag this down and hide this, and if I select these edges here at the bottom, you can see in the coordinates manager down here that the distance is 0.5. So we don't have straight edges. And what we're going to do is we're going to scale these edges down. And I'm going to do this for all of these. It's not going to change the shape too much. And doing this once should actually be okay. But I'm going to show you something. So if you take a look at the edge of this object, you can see we're following the shape and it's still nice and smooth. But if you want to be more accurate, you could reuse that shrink wrap deformer. And again, use current state to object. And let's go ahead and hide this. And if I select the lid and select these edges, you can see the distance now only is 0.2. And if we repeat this process, shrink wrapping the object will cause less and less distortion. Okay, so we can put this in a shrink wrap, or we could use a shrink wrap as a child of this lid again, and again use current state to object. And if I select these edges, you can see now it's only 0.1. Let's do this one more time. You don't necessarily need to do that, because the first time we straightened out these edges, we didn't really change the shape of the object. So once, in this case, would have been sufficient, I think. Okay, so again, current state to object, and let's see. And you can see now we only have a very small distance between these edges. And I'm going to even these out one more time and make them straight. Okay. So now let's create the rest of the shape. I'm going to double click on one of these edges down here to select the entire loop, and let's go ahead and quick extrude these down like so. And let's use close polygon hole to close that hole at the bottom, and I'm going to select the n-gon here and use extrude inner and do maybe something like this. I don't really need an inside here, so I'm just going to delete this n-gon. Okay, and next what we're going to do is we're going to select the polygons here at the top. Let's maybe do this in the top view. And I'm going to use UY to grow the selection, and then I'm going to add these polygons here to the selection with the live selection tool. Okay, so we need all of these ones, and I'm going to use D for extrude, and let's extrude these up maybe, let's do 5 centimeters. That should be fine. Now we still need to create this extension here, and that's what we're going to do next. And maybe let's select the polygons here on the side. So I'm going to grab these two and, well, selected the wrong ones. I actually wanted these ones here. And I'm going to use Extrude to extrude them out like this. And maybe let's move these down a little bit, just, you know, to follow that curved shape a little bit better. Something like this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete most of the object again. So let's get rid of all of this geometry here. And all of this geometry, and I think we could also get rid of half of the remaining object as well, but in order to do that we would need to connect these points here, and then we can select these edges, UF, and I'm going to select this part here. It's not really working. It actually should. Why doesn't it? Oh, because it doesn't work because we also need this edge here. So UF, and now we can select this part and delete it and optimize the object. So this is what we have left, and what I'm going to do with this part is I'm going to delete these two polygons, and I'm going to bridge these edges here and these ones here, and that will give us the extended part of that lid here. And it looks like we need to move some of the points up a little bit. I'll just copy the Y position of these points here and paste it here, and just set this Y value to a 0. Okay, so that's looking good, except we have this triangle here, and I think the best way to solve this is to connect these two edges, connect these 2 points, and then dissolve this edge here. So that will give us quads here. And now we can add the control edges. So let's go to edge mode, and I'm going to do a func break selection here, select all the edges. And we did select all the edges that we need, and now we can use the bevel tool to create our control edges. I'm going to switch the mode to solid, and left click and drag, and let's do maybe, let's see, 1.5. I don't want to bring these edges too close together. Let's do maybe around 1.4, something like this should do. And you can see we're having an issue here. We could solve that by changing the mitering to uniform. However, this will cause other issues down here, and I actually prefer to keep it at default. And up here we can simply select these points and use the weld tool to weld these together like so. And then we need to fix the geometry down here. Now, as far as this corner is concerned, we can do this in a number of ways. One would be to add a lot of, well, not a lot of, but at least 2 or 3 edges along here. But I don't really want to do that because it would make the geometry here way too dense. The other way, which is the one that we're going to use, is we're going to create additional edges here. We only need 1 additional edge loop here, so the geometry will not get too dense. The disadvantage, of course, is that the geometry will not be as evenly spaced as it was before. But I think it's a compromise that we can live with, and we can make sure that we maintain this curved shape here and get less dense geometry. So let's switch to edge mode and select these edges here. I'm going to use connect points edges, and then we can use the line cut tool and create edges like this. And dissolve these edges here. Which will give us quad topology, and then we could select these edges, use the slide tool and slide these up a bit, but not too far, because you can see we're getting a very stretched polygon here. So maybe let's do something like this, and we could also maybe slide these edges up a little bit further. And then I'm just going to make a cut like this and get rid of these edges here, just to straighten out the geometry a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Okay, let's dissolve these edges and maybe move this point over a little bit, just to make everything a little more even. And we have another issue down here where we need to fix the geometry. And the technique will be exactly the same. So we need edges here, here, and here. You could do it like that and get, you know, polygons that are a little bit stretched. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an edge loop here. And let's make some cuts. We need to connect these points here and yeah, well, these points here. But I think what I'll do instead is I'll make a cut straight across like so, because, and the reason, you know, the reason I'm doing this is when we bring everything together and mirror it over, we're going to get a pretty complex pole here. Now, usually I don't continue control edges like this across the object, but in this case, I think it's slightly better than having a massive pole here. Although it wouldn't really matter because we have a flat surface down here, so we would get away with a complex pole as well. But let's just do it this way and see how things look. So now we can dissolve these edges here and these ones, and that will give us our quad topology down here. Let's go ahead and move this point over a little bit and even out everything like this. And you can see we're still getting a complex pole here, but we'll get one somewhere. So at least we're having one less because we solved this area up here a little bit differently. If you don't want this complex pole here, we would have to add more geometry. So for example, we could connect these points here, get rid of this edge, and then just add another edge loop in here. Although this wouldn't really solve the problem because we still have this n-gon here, which would mean we need to move this edge over here somewhere. And I don't really want to do that because it would change the circular shape here. So let's keep it like this, and I'll just undo that. So this should actually do fine. Let's go ahead and rotate this 45 degrees like this. Reset the axis and mirror this over. I'm going to make this editable. And again, rotate the object like so, again 45 degrees. And let's reset the axis. And then add two symmetry objects like so. And let's go ahead and make this editable. And that is our finished lid. The only thing we need to change is we need to get rid of these triangles here by dissolving these edges. So we need to do the same thing here. Okay, And that's looking good. Let's see how that looks when we subdivide it. And I think we're getting something that is looking pretty clean. It's a bit difficult to see. Let's add a white material. Just going to add a simple material here. Let's drag this onto the subdivision surface object. Yeah, and it's actually looking pretty good, I think. Okay, so that's the lid part. We still need the bottom, and arguably you could do this as a single object and just extrude the edges, but I'm going to do a separate object here. Let's deselect everything, and in order to create the base we could actually use a spline, and let's switch off that subdivision surface object, and if I switch on snapping I could, let's snap it to here, then switch to the move tool and switch to point mode, and now we can quick extrude this point over like so, and let's extrude this down and over and down, and I'm going to move this point over to here and then extrude again and again. Let's select these 2 points here. I'm going to scale these and move these over a bit to roughly here maybe. So this is the base, and we can put this spline in a lathe object like so, and I'm going to rename this and change the Phong angle to 33. And now we just need to increase, not the Phong angle, but the subdivisions. I'm going to make it about the same as our lid, something like this. And of course, if we subdivide this, it's not going to look good because we don't have any control edges. And you could, of course, make this object editable and create control edges, but we could also use the spline in point mode. And let's go ahead and, well, I want to close that spline maybe, and then we can use the line cut tool and create control edges like this. Okay, and we need one here and one here, one here and one here. I'll just do this quickly. Let me just solo that spline. Okay, so we need one more here actually. So let's add a cut here. And I'm going to unsolo that. And for this, by the way, I'm also using a script from the HB modeling bundle, which is called HB Solo. Okay, so let's switch on the lathe object and the subdivision surface object, NI, to switch to isopower mode. And there we go. That is our base here. Looking pretty good, I think. So this is the end of the tutorial. There's one thing that I wanted to show you, because which one was it? I think it was the part 4. Here you can see a number of lids, and this one over here, that was actually the basis for the lid that we just did. And this one is based on a kit bash object that was not done using subdivision surface modeling, so the geometry was pretty awful, and I remodeled this, and you can see here I did a couple of different iterations using different topology just to see how things turn out, and I made a low poly version, a higher poly version that is intended to, you know, add smaller details maybe. And you can see I have different topology over here for the lower poly object, and I have a higher poly version as well. And the reason I'm showing you this is because when you do this kind of modeling, always try and, always try and do different versions, use different topology and see how things turn out. All of these are actually pretty decent, but I do prefer this type of topology, and that's the kind of topology that we just created for the lid. And the reason is because, and I mentioned that earlier in the tutorial, this will be more suitable for adding additional detail along the edges, whereas this type of topology wouldn't necessarily support that, and it's probably not as visible on this low poly version. But if you take a look at the higher poly object, you can see we have this area here where the geometry is pretty dense, and it would be kind of difficult to add details here. But if you don't add any further details, especially not around the edges, then this kind of topology would be fine as well. So if you practice modeling stuff like this, try and come up with different versions and see how things turn out, and find out what topology would work in what situation and what wouldn't work. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial. I wish you all a happy new year. Take care, and I'll see you again soon.